I've dealt with my fair share of ridiculous HOA rules. You name it, mailbox colors, grass height, fence paint, they've tried to regulate it, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the day I came home to find every single one of my vehicles gone. Not just my truck, not just the sedan, but even my wife's SUV and my son's old project car parked in the driveway. All towed, all at once, no warnings, no courtesy notices, just gone. Now, before you think I'm the kind of neighbor who lets his front lawn turn into a junkyard, let me explain something. I live in a gated neighborhood where appearances matter, sure, but I'm also a clean, respectful resident. My vehicles are well kept, tagged, insured, and parked neatly in the driveway or directly in front of my property. No street blocking, no oil leaks, nothing even remotely violating. That's why what happened next felt more like a hit job than a community service. It started the week after the new HOA president took over. Some 50-something woman named Darlene who thinks she's running a private country club instead of a neighborhood. She walks around in these oversized sunglasses, carries a clipboard like it's a badge of honor, and acts like she was born with the divine right to micromanage everyone's lives. She gave me weird vibes from the start, especially after our first HOA meeting where she suggested towing should be used as a disciplinary tool for non-compliance. Yeah, you read that right. Not for abandoned cars or safety violations, but as a punishment. The board agreed way too quickly, by the way. I knew I had to be careful. Still, I figured as long as I stayed within the rules, I'd be fine. My vehicles were all registered. I even triple-checked the covenants and bylaws just to be sure I wasn't inadvertently in violation. I paid my dues. I kept my yard trimmed. I was the model resident, really. That's what made it all the more insane when I came home from work one Thursday afternoon and found 4 empty parking spaces where my vehicles used to be. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe my son had moved the cars to mess with me. Maybe a neighbor borrowed one. But within minutes, my phone buzzed with a text from the HOA. Your vehicles were in violation of community parking policy and have been removed at owner's expense. Contact the towing company listed in your HOA handbook. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Removed? At my expense? Now here's where the story turns from frustrating to almost poetic. Because the towing company listed in the HOA handbook, the very one they contracted to enforce their insane rules, is my company. Not that they knew that. I run my business through a parent company with a different name. I keep things compartmentalized for tax and liability purposes. The HOA thought they were working with Rapid Response Recovery Services. What they didn't realize is that I own it. Every truck, every employee, every invoice, they all answer to me. And that's when I realized they'd just opened the door to a world of pain for themselves. I immediately called my operations manager, Tony. "Hey," I said, trying to keep the laughter out of my voice, "who authorized the tows on my property today?" He paused. "Oh man, I was gonna call you about that. We got a rush order from the HOA over in Briarwood Estates. Said it was urgent, 4 vehicles parked in violation. Sent a couple trucks over like we always do. Didn't realize those were your cars, boss." I told him not to worry and to keep the paperwork. "Make sure we have everything documented," I added. "Every call log, photo, timestamp. This is about to get interesting." My first instinct was to storm down to the next HOA meeting and tear into them, but I decided to play it differently. I wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole went. If they were targeting me, chances were they were targeting others. And if I could expose that, I could bring this whole petty empire crashing down. Over the next few days, I requested copies of the violation notices, none of which were ever sent to me. I requested proof that I'd been warned in advance. There was none. I even checked their towing policy, which required 2 written warnings and a 5-day grace period before any action could be taken. They skipped all of that. The kicker? The HOA had been sending towing invoices directly to residents, pocketing the checks, and never passing the payments along to the towing company. They were double charging us, collecting HOA fines while also billing for the same services through my company. That meant I had the legal grounds to charge them for services rendered, plus interest. Oh, and potentially hit them with fraud. Now, I didn't just want repayment, I wanted retribution. So I called a meeting with my legal team. I want to sue the HOA for breach of contract, unauthorized use of services, and violation of community guidelines, I said. But I also want to make this public. Let the residents know what's on. Darlene sat there stunned, her mouth slightly open like a trout pulled out of water. Her hand hovered over the folder like it might burn her to touch it. The rest of the board members looked just as shocked, some blinking rapidly, others shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. It was like a bad school play where the villain gets caught monologuing, only this time the consequences were real. I think we need to adjourn this meeting until we can review these documents, one of the board members muttered, clearly trying to stop the bleeding. Oh, don't worry, I said calmly. You'll have time to review them. I've already sent copies to every homeowner in the neighborhood, every page, every timestamp, every law you broke. I figured transparency is what this HOA claims to be about, right? I turned on my heel and walked out, not waiting for a response. The ball was now in motion, and I knew exactly how this would play out. When you shine a light on shady dealings like this, cockroaches always scatter, and my trap was baited, locked, and ready. By the next morning, the story had spread to neighboring communities. One of the residents had forwarded the HOA documents to a local news station who ran a segment about abuse of power in suburban HOAs. They didn't name names, but the footage was shot just outside our gates. Anyone watching could put the pieces together. The clip went viral in the neighborhood Facebook and Nextdoor groups. Comments flooded in, some angry, some shocked, and plenty of people sharing similar horror stories about their HOAs. I wasn't surprised when I got a call from the board's attorney. "We'd like to resolve this amicably," he said, his voice laced with forced politeness. "Perhaps a settlement, with non-disclosure terms to protect both parties?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Amicably? Your client violated multiple contracts, misused services, and defrauded residents. I'm not looking for a quiet settlement. I'm looking for accountability." There was a long pause. Then, "Would you be open to mediation?" I agreed, on one condition, that the mediation take place on my terms, at my office, in front of an independent arbitrator. He reluctantly agreed. I had the upper hand, and he knew it. Before the meeting, I met with my legal team and mapped out every charge, every violation, and every dollar owed. We had them dead to rights on illegal towing, failure to follow HOA procedures, misuse of funds, and, perhaps most damaging, breach of contract. The towing agreement itself stated that the HOA was responsible for all service charges incurred, whether or not they collected those fees from residents, and they hadn't paid a dime for 3 months. At the mediation, Darlene tried to play it cool. She came dressed in her usual faux designer attire, carrying a tablet like she was still in control. But as the evidence piled up, page after page of invoices, security camera footage from my property showing no violations, copies of HOA bylaws they had blatantly ignored, her facade started to crumble. I let my attorney do most of the talking. I just sat there, arms folded, watching her squirm. Eventually, their side leaned over to whisper among themselves, and then her lawyer looked up. My client is willing to pay the outstanding balance with interest. In exchange, we request a confidentiality agreement to prevent further reputational harm. I leaned forward for the first time. That's not going to happen, I said. You don't get to drag my name through the mud, abuse your power, and then sweep it under the rug. I want full payment, public apology, and your immediate resignation from the board. That's the deal. She opened her mouth, ready to protest, but I cut her off. You wanted to teach me a lesson, I said. Well, here it is. Never mess with someone whose name is on the checks you sign. After several tense minutes, she relented. Payment would be made within 14 days. The apology letter would be sent to all residents under HOA letterhead, and her resignation would be submitted by the end of the week. I made sure it was all in writing, notarized, and legally binding. But I wasn't done. I went to work exposing the broader problems within the HOA. With Darlene gone, other board members began to speak up. Turns out she'd been intimidating them too, threatening to file petty infractions against their homes, fining them for imaginary rule violations, even trying to blacklist vendors who didn't play ball. Once the story got out, the board dissolved within 2 weeks. A new election was held, and, no surprise, I was nominated to the new board. I didn't plan to run. I had no desire to micromanage my neighbors, but they practically begged me, saying they needed someone who actually respected the rules and the people living under them. So I accepted, not out of ego, but because I knew if I didn't, someone like Darlene would just take over again. As the new HOA president, my first order of business was simple: total transparency. I opened the books. I rewrote the bylaws to protect homeowners, not harass them. I eliminated all third-party contracts that weren't competitively bid, including the overpriced landscaping deal Darlene had arranged with her cousin's company. And the towing policy? I gutted it. From now on, no vehicle could be towed without a personal notice, signed proof of violation, and a 5-day grace period. I even created an appeals board made up of regular residents, not board members, to prevent abuse. But perhaps my favorite part? At the annual HOA meeting, I revealed something that had everyone laughing for 10 straight minutes. I pulled out one of our community newsletters from 3 months ago, the one where Darlene bragged about partnering with a new towing company to keep our streets clean. I held it up and said, "The company she partnered with? That's me. I own it." The room erupted. People couldn't believe it. One guy in the back yelled, "Man, that's like hiring Batman to clean up Gotham and not realizing who Bruce Wayne is." The applause that followed was the loudest I'd ever heard in a neighborhood meeting. But even with Darlene gone and the HOA reformed, there was one more loose end I wanted to tie up: the money she had pocketed through fraudulent fines and illegal towing. Using the evidence I had gathered, I referred the case to the county district attorney's office. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power. It wasn't just civil, it was criminal. And while I couldn't guarantee she'd do time, I could sure as hell make sure she faced justice. A month later, I got the news. She was being investigated for financial misconduct, and several other residents had joined in the complaint. Sometimes karma needs a little push, and this time it was delivered on a flatbed tow truck by the very man she tried to ruin. Once the DA's office got involved, everything escalated. I had expected a drawn-out investigation, but within a week, subpoenas were going out. It turned out the HOA's finances were even messier than I thought. Darlene hadn't just been abusing the towing policy. She'd been dipping into community funds for personal expenses too. Lavish dinners, spa visits, and even a payment on what appeared to be a private cruise vacation, all billed under Community Improvement Consulting. I remember getting a call from a former board member who had resigned months earlier. His name was Jeff, quiet guy, worked in IT, didn't say much during meetings. I didn't know who to trust back then, he told me, but I always knew something was wrong with how Darlene ran things. She'd scream at anyone who questioned a line item on the budget. I asked him if he had documentation. He did. Lots of it. Emails, receipts, board minutes she edited before circulating, even a voice recording of a meeting where she explicitly told the treasurer to just hide the numbers. No one reads the fine print anyway. That one recording alone was damning. I forwarded it all to the DA. But that wasn't all. More and more residents came forward with their own stories. One couple had been fined nearly $1,500 for non-compliant holiday decorations, despite using HOA-approved lighting. Another man, retired veteran, lived down the street, had his fence torn down because Darlene claimed it was an unauthorized structure, even though it had stood for 20 years and was part of the original property design. All of this came to light because one power-hungry woman couldn't resist flexing her ego over someone she didn't realize had the leverage to dismantle her empire. Meanwhile, my own position as HOA president was going smoother than I anticipated. I didn't love the meetings, but I loved the reform. We installed a resident-first complaint system, hired an independent CPA to audit the HOA books annually, and started publishing full financial reports online for transparency. For the first time in years, people actually wanted to participate in HOA affairs instead of hiding from them. I kept my towing company strictly out of the community's affairs. In fact, I ended our contract the month I took over. It's a conflict of interest, I told the board. We'll find someone else, someone fair. That decision earned a lot of respect from residents, especially those who'd initially been skeptical of me stepping in. But Darlene? Her story was just beginning to spiral. The DA's office froze her personal assets pending the investigation. She tried to deflect, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just trying to uphold community standards. But no one was buying that, especially not when local reporters dug into her background and found that she'd been booted from 2 previous HOA boards in other neighborhoods for personality conflicts and financial discrepancies. She was a serial power abuser, and now she was exposed. One morning, I was sipping coffee on my front porch when I saw something oddly poetic. A tow truck rolling down the street. Not one of mine, a city-commissioned one. On the flatbed sat Darlene's prized Lexus, the same one she used to cruise the neighborhood during her daily compliance inspections. The driver stopped in front of her house, spoke briefly with a sheriff's deputy, then towed the car away. Turns out she hadn't made payments in months. The same woman who once lectured the community about financial responsibility had defaulted on her own vehicle loan. Couldn't have written it better myself. Of course, the legal process dragged on. It always does. But I kept the pressure up, attending every court hearing, offering testimony, and encouraging others to do the same. We weren't out for blood. We just wanted justice. We wanted to make sure she couldn't quietly move to another neighborhood and start the cycle again. The real kicker came 6 months later when a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 37 residents. Damages included unauthorized fines, emotional distress, and property devaluation. I wasn't part of the lawsuit. I couldn't be because of my role as HOA president, but I provided every piece of evidence I had. Her attorney tried everything to delay the process, claimed her health was failing, that she was being harassed, that the community had turned against her. But the judge wasn't buying it. He ordered a preliminary trial date and refused to throw out any of the charges. By then, the story had reached regional news. Reporters stood outside the courtroom. Cameras rolled. HOA corruption wasn't just a neighborhood issue anymore. It had become a cautionary tale across the state. Still, I wasn't done with her. See, Darlene had caused real damage. That veteran with the fence? His insurance premium went up because the HOA falsely reported a non-compliant property modification. The couple with the holiday lights? They'd pulled their kids out of school events because of the public shaming Darlene orchestrated in community emails. She'd humiliated, harassed, and robbed people who just wanted peace and quiet. So I started something else. I built a website, HOAtruthwatch.org, where people could submit stories about their own HOA experiences, not just from our neighborhood, but from all over. Within weeks, it became a hub for whistleblowers, reformers, and people sick of petty dictators in polos. I even hosted a podcast once a month with residents telling their stories. It blew up. Local sponsors reached out. Lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes asked to partner. What began as a personal fight turned into a movement. And Darlene? She couldn't hide from it. Every time someone searched her name, articles popped up, court records, news segments, even screenshots of her angry HOA emails. The internet doesn't forget, and neither do the people she wronged. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of all came not in a courtroom or a neighborhood meeting, but in a simple certified letter. It arrived one afternoon, addressed to me as HOA president. Inside was Darlene's formal notice of surrendering all rights and responsibilities in Briarwood Estates. Not just resignation, complete forfeiture of her property. She sold her home at a loss and moved away. No forwarding address, no apology. Just gone. Darlene vanishing from Briarwood Estates felt surreal, like the final scene in a movie where the villain slinks away into exile. No farewell, no remorse, just an empty house with a crooked for sale sign and a brittle silence in place of her usual self-righteous marching up and down the sidewalks. I passed by her home once after she'd left. The shutters were faded. The lawn, once obsessively manicured, was overgrown and wild, like the neighborhood itself was purging her memory. But even in her absence, her damage lingered. Unraveling everything she had built meant dealing with the mess she left behind. Legal documentation was a wreck. Records were missing. HOA decisions had been made without proper votes or forged signatures. Some vendors hadn't been paid in months. Others had been double paid. including her cousin's landscaping company, which had charged for services never rendered. I led a full-scale audit. The results were shocking but not surprising. Tens of thousands of dollars in community funds had been misused or outright stolen. Darlene had operated the HOA like her personal ATM, and the rest of the board, either too intimidated or too lazy, had let it happen. I worked with our new board and our CPA to recover what we could, launching small claims actions where possible. The community's trust wasn't something I could restore with a memo. It had to be earned back slowly, one action at a time. But one major victory came out of it. The residents finally started to care. The people who used to avoid board meetings like the plague were now showing up early, asking real questions, demanding transparency. It was the kind of participation HOAs are supposed to be built on. People had finally realized that silence equals surrender. Meanwhile, the movement I'd started online through hotruthwatch.org was catching fire. The stories were heartbreaking and enraging. In one neighborhood, a family had been fined thousands for repainting their front door a shade too dark. In another, an HOA had tried to evict a woman for installing a wheelchair ramp for her disabled son, citing aesthetic disruption. The deeper I dug, the more it became clear. This wasn't about rules. This was about power and how easily it could corrupt when there were no checks and balances. We started organizing petitions, public awareness campaigns, legal resources for homeowners who had been abused. Some of our allies were lawyers, others were journalists, and many were just regular people who'd had enough. We hosted webinars, community town halls, and even started working with lawmakers on policy reforms. Yes, me, the guy who used to keep to himself and run a towing company on the side, was now sitting in a city council chamber, advocating for HOA accountability laws. And to my surprise, people were listening. Briarwood became a case study in reform. We rewrote our bylaws to include term limits for board members, mandatory financial disclosures, and strict penalties for anyone using their position for personal gain. We created a resident oversight committee, separate from the board, to review all complaints and prevent abuse. We even implemented a policy where every fine issued had to include photo evidence, documentation of the specific rule violated, and an option to appeal before the fine could be enforced. It was bureaucracy, sure, but the right kind. The kind that kept power honest. Despite the chaos, my business thrived. Not just because I had been vindicated, but because I'd gained something more valuable than profits, credibility. People knew I played fair. My company now had contracts with multiple nearby towns and neighborhoods who wanted an ethical partner. Some HOAs even hired us after seeing what had happened in Briarwood. The irony was rich. But perhaps the most unexpected part of all this was what it did to my personal life. I'd always been the type to stay quiet, keep to my lane. The guy who showed up, did the job, and left. But this experience forced me out of my shell. I connected with neighbors I barely knew. I made friends with people I'd once considered just background extras in my suburban routine. And then there was Mrs. Carter. She lived 4 houses down, widowed, retired schoolteacher, quiet and kind with a sharp wit. She was one of the first people Darlene had targeted, back when she refused to tear out her rose bushes, which didn't fit the landscape plan. Darlene fined her weekly until she caved. After Darlene was gone, I helped Mrs. Carter replant her roses. One afternoon, While I was digging up soil in her front yard, she brought me lemonade and said, "You know, you could have just let it go. Most people would have. But you didn't." I looked up at her and shrugged. Someone had to stand up to her. She nodded. True. But not everyone would have stood up for everyone else, too. That's the difference. That stuck with me. What began as a personal fight to protect my property, my rights, had become something more. It had become about protecting everyone's rights, about restoring dignity to people who'd been bullied into submission by a system that was never meant to be so authoritarian. A few months later, the lawsuit against Darlene went to trial. She tried to settle at the last minute, but the plaintiffs weren't having it. They wanted their day in court. I sat in the front row, surrounded by residents who had once feared her. This time, they were fearless. The trial was brutal for her. The evidence was overwhelming: financial fraud, abuse of authority, intentional deception. The plaintiffs had receipts, literally, and the jury didn't need long to deliberate. Guilty. She was ordered to pay damages, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her accounts were seized. Her professional reputation, if she had one, was ruined. She was barred from serving on any HOA board in the state for life. She left the courtroom flanked by lawyers, head down, avoiding cameras. The woman who once roamed the streets with a clipboard like a self-proclaimed sheriff had been exposed, dismantled, and finally brought to justice. And we walked out into the sunlight. Together. You'd think that would be the end of it. Court case 1. HOA dictatorship dismantled. Reputation restored. The villain gone. And yeah, for most people, that would have been enough. But the scars Darlene left didn't fade so easily for some of the people she hurt. Take Mr. Alvarez, for example. He lived near the entrance of Briarwood Estates, a Vietnam vet who spent most of his days quietly tending to his modest garden and sipping iced tea on his porch. Darlene once fined him for having an unsanctioned American flag display. All he had was a small pole attached to his porch. It was faded, but clean. Darlene insisted it was not regulation-sized and gave him 72 hours to remove it or face daily fines. That flag had been folded over his brother's coffin when he came home from the war. When I found that out, I didn't just apologize. I flew a brand new flag at the entrance of the neighborhood with a dedication plaque for all veterans in our community. Mr. Alvarez cried when he saw it. The stories kept surfacing like that, quiet traumas that Darlene had caused, the kind people didn't talk about during her reign because they feared retaliation. One resident shared how her teenage son had received a written warning because he parked his bike improperly in their own driveway. Another woman recalled how her elderly mother received a threatening letter because her wind chimes were audibly disruptive to neighborhood tranquility. It was absurd and infuriating, and yet somehow healing, because now people could speak freely, laugh about it even. We started holding community nights, movie screenings, potlucks, gardening clubs, normal neighborhood stuff. For the first time in a long time, Briarwood felt like a community, not a battleground. The house Darlene had abandoned eventually sold. The new owners were a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. They'd heard all about the previous HOA queen, but weren't deterred. I stopped by on move-in day with some homemade barbecue and a six-pack, and the guy, Mark, grinned and said, "I hope you're the guy who ran her out of here." I just smiled. The legend was already growing. But beyond Briarwood, something bigger was happening. HoTruthWatch.org had grown from a simple site into a full-blown platform. We had contributors, regional organizers, even legal advisors helping people draft response letters and defend themselves against predatory HOAs. Our YouTube channel, yeah, we started one too, had gone viral thanks to a segment we did on the 10 pettiest HOA rules that backfired. One of the clips from that episode, me explaining how Darlene fined a kid $50 for having a lemonade stand, racked up over 3 million views in 2 weeks. Suddenly I was being invited onto local TV and even national podcasts to talk about HOA accountability. We weren't just fighting one HOA anymore. We were fighting the entire culture of unchecked community power. I wasn't in it for fame, and I sure wasn't in it for money. But the cause mattered. Too many people were living in fear, afraid to hang a flag, plant a flower, or let their kids draw with sidewalk chalk because of tyrannical HOA boards. Our mission was simple: empower homeowners, expose corruption, and reform the system. And you'd be surprised how many people rallied behind that banner. We started collaborating with housing attorneys and even a few politicians interested in regulation. I testified in front of a state committee about the need for better oversight on HOA boards. We proposed a Homeowner Rights Act that would mandate transparent voting, open financial reporting, and third-party arbitration for disputes. It was a long shot. Legislative reform always is. But the fact that we were even in the room was progress. And then came the twist I never saw coming. One of the largest HOA management companies in the state, the same one Darlene had worked with, reached out to me. At first, I was suspicious. Thought they were going to threaten me, sue me, try to bury the site. But no, they wanted a meeting. I agreed with my attorney by my side. To my shock, they didn't deny anything. The regional VP, a clean-cut guy named Scott, said, "Look, we know the system's broken, but we're not all Darlene. Some of us actually want to fix things. Your voice carries weight right now. We'd rather work with you than against you." I didn't commit to anything that day. But I told him, if you really want to fix it, start by cleaning your own house. 2 weeks later, that company terminated their contracts with 5 of the worst-reviewed HOAs in the state. They started publishing their own transparency initiative, modeled after ours. And I started hearing from board members who were genuinely trying to do right but didn't know where to begin. We built a toolkit. Free downloads, printable checklists, fair practice templates. Stuff that empowered regular people to take back control of their neighborhoods. It was working. But despite all this momentum, I never forgot how it started. One woman. One ego. One act of pettiness so blatant that it triggered a chain reaction she never could have imagined. She towed all my cars to prove a point, and it blew up in her face. There's a quote I keep on my office wall now. It's from Abraham Lincoln, but it hits different when you've lived through a suburban war zone. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Darlene failed that test spectacularly. And the people of Briarwood? We passed with flying colors. 6 months after Darlene's downfall, I stood at the entrance of Briarwood Estates, watching a crew install our brand new welcome sign. It was elegant, black with brushed bronze lettering that read, "Welcome to Briarwood, a neighborhood by the people, for the people." Underneath that, in smaller text, homeowner-led, transparent, accountable. The sign wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol, a declaration, a reminder that we'd taken our power back and we weren't giving it up again. We'd come a long way from the days when neighbors whispered in fear and nobody dared park a truck in their driveway. Our community had become a model for how an HOA could work with people instead of against them. We had set up quarterly open forums, rotating leadership roles, and even a community newsletter where we joked about HOA flashbacks and gave monthly shoutouts to residents making positive contributions. And every year on the anniversary of what we called Toe Day, we hosted a block party. Yes, that Toe Day. The one where Darlene tried to humiliate me and instead triggered her own demise. Residents started treating it like a holiday. Kids drew chalk outlines of imaginary car tows. People made t-shirts that said, "I got towed by Darlene and all I got was community reform," and we held a BBQ competition judged by yours truly. I never thought vengeance would taste like smoked brisket and cornbread, but here we were. HoTruthWatch.org kept growing. We launched a podcast, the HOA Survivor Files, where people shared their stories, some hilarious, others heartbreaking. One episode featured a family that had been fined for building a little free library box in their yard. Another talked about a disabled man who had to sue his HOA just to build a wheelchair-accessible ramp. Every time I thought I'd heard the worst of it, a new case reminded me why we had to keep going. But not everyone saw me as a hero. There were still HOA loyalists out there, people who believed in absolute order, no matter how cruel or ridiculous the rule. Some of them hated what I represented. They sent nasty emails, accused me of turning neighborhoods into anarchist playgrounds. One guy even told me I'd single-handedly ruined suburban America. I laughed out loud reading that one. As if suburban America hadn't already done a fine job ruining itself. But here's the truth they didn't want to admit. We weren't tearing anything down. We were rebuilding it better, with fairness, empathy, and common sense. And maybe most importantly, with humor. You have to laugh after you've survived something ridiculous. And trust me, towing your own vehicles off your own property just to expose a tyrannical HOA president? That's ridiculous. The story made rounds for months. Reddit, local news, even a BuzzFeed listicle titled, "This guy owned the tow truck company that towed his own cars, and you won't believe what happened next." I believed it. I lived it. Even my employees still got a kick out of it. At our holiday party, someone made a cake shaped like a little car getting towed. The words HOA this were written in frosting on the side. And yeah, I took a picture with it. But all jokes aside, it made me realize something deeper about revenge and justice. Revenge is satisfying. Justice is powerful. But transformation? That's lasting. We didn't just get even with Darlene. We didn't just remove a problem. We changed something for the better. Not just for our street, but for neighborhoods across the country. And I wasn't done. We started a nonprofit, Neighborhood Rights Alliance. We offered free legal consultations, connected homeowners with fair mediation professionals, and hosted training seminars for HOA board members who wanted to do the job right. We didn't just call out the villains, we equipped the heroes. Our motto? Because your home should feel like home. And through it all, I never stopped running my towing company. Strangely, our reputation soared. Not because we towed more, but because people trusted us. We implemented new policies to help avoid unnecessary tows. We gave grace periods. We even started partnering with local churches to assist families who couldn't pay fines. Funny how doing the right thing ends up being good for business too. People often ask me if I miss the quiet life I had before all this happened. I tell them, sure, sometimes. It was peaceful, predictable, but then I remember what it felt like to walk outside and feel like a criminal on my own property. What it felt like to watch my wife plead with a woman on a power trip while my cars were dragged away in front of my own house. I remember thinking, this is insane. This can't be normal. And I remember the decision that followed. If nobody else is going to stop this, then I will. That moment changed everything. So no, I don't miss the silence. I don't miss the fear. I don't miss pretending everything was okay while someone else abused control. I like the noise now, the laughter, the debates, the community potlucks, the sound of neighbors standing up for each other. I like freedom, because no matter how many lawns you manicure, no matter how precisely you edge your hedges or match your mailbox to your shutters, it all means nothing if people don't feel safe and respected where they live. That's what we fought for, and that's why I'll keep fighting. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't just towing your own cars to catch a tyrant red-handed. Sometimes the best revenge is giving the power back to the people they tried to control and letting them drive their neighborhoods forward on their own terms.